Let's consider one of my favorite passages in the New Testament, Romans chapter 8, verses 18 through 23. Let's briefly reflect on the immediate context of our text, mainly verses 15 through 17 and then 24 through 30. So let's read verses 15 through 17 of Romans 8. This is from the New King James Version. It says, "You did not receive the spirit of bondage again to fear, but you received the spirit of adoption by whom we cry out, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God, and if children, then heirs, heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified together." Now, those to whom Paul wrote nearly 2,000 years ago had received the spirit of adoption in opposition to the spirit of bondage, verse 15 says, and this spirit was their assurance that they, as joint heirs with God's Son, were chosen by the Lord to be snatched out of the bondage of fearful slaves and into the liberty of beloved children, children of God. You can check out 2 Timothy 1:7, Romans 8:38 through 39, and especially Galatians 4:1 through 7 in reference to this. So why were they suffering at this time if they had received the spirit of adoption as children in contrast to the spirit of bondage as slaves? Because, as this entire section in Romans 8 teaches, they were in the midst of a period of transition or transformation. In other words, they had yet to receive the fullness of their inheritance, and their suffering was part of the new covenant probation stipulations for that magnificent and eternal inheritance, something in which they were actually to be overjoyed, since, as verse 18 says, it was beyond compare. Every letter Paul wrote, if not directly geared toward encouraging the suffering, at least had a percentage of it devoted to reassurance of the light at the end of their tunnel as being something which would far outshine any afflictions they endured. Just check out 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Paul wrote quite a bit about this to those in Philippi who were encouraged to do as he was doing and rejoice in distress, for, due to the reward of it all, he spoke of their suffering for Christ as being an honor. Chapter 1:29. Also check out Philippians 1:18, 2:18, chapter 3 verse 1, chapter 4 verse 4, and in chapter 2 verse 16 he spoke of how, as their example, he considered it a privilege to endure all things so that he could rejoice in the day of Christ, not having run or labored in vain. A few remarks there on verses 15 through 17 to kind of set up our text of 18 through 23. But before we get into 18 through 23 specifically, let's read verses 24 through 30 to get the other side, the other bookend of our primary text. It says, "We were saved in this hope, but hope that is seen is not hope, for why does one still hope for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, then we eagerly wait for it with perseverance. Likewise, the Spirit also helps in our weaknesses, for we do not know what we should pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself makes intercession for us with groanings which cannot be uttered. Now he who searches the hearts knows what the mind of the Spirit is, because he makes intercession for the saints according to the will of God. And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. For whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom he predestined, those he also called. Whom he called, these he also justified. And whom he justified, these he also glorified." We see pretty clearly in these verses that they were still, at the time Paul was writing to them, in a period of hope, verse 24, a period through which, due to their hope, they could eagerly persevere, verse 25. And even though it was a time of groanings which couldn't be uttered, verse 26, they could have faith in the knowledge that the God who gave them this Spirit knew the mind of this Spirit, that would and could relay their needs to their Father, verse 27, while they could rest in the assurance that God was working out all things for their eternal good, verse 28, for he was the great architect and conductor of the entire plan for them to be conformed to the image of his Son, and thus be justified and glorified, verses 29 through 30, making them more than conquerors, verse 37, of any and all tribulation, distress, persecution, and so on, verse 35. So that's just a real quick summary of verses 24 through 30 and touching on 35 and 37 as well, to help us have this other bookend. So in the midst of all these wonderful, encouraging remarks that Paul had made concerning their transition from slaves of law, such as was perfectly experienced under the Old Covenant system, to children of grace under the New Covenant system, what did Paul say to them in explanation of what they were then experiencing? Well, that brings us finally to our text passage, verses 18 through 23. I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. For the earnest expectation of the creation eagerly waits for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope, because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs together until now. And not only they, but we also, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, eagerly waiting for the adoption, the redemption of our body. So let's focus our attention first on verse 18, of course, most specifically the phrase, this present time. The original word for the present could just as well be translated as the current or the now, and so it referred to the generation in which Paul was then living 2,000 years ago. There are two chief Greek words for time. Chronos refers to time in its general or ordinary sense, while kairos refers to something much more specific. Trench's Synonyms of the New Testament volume says that chronos is the interval at which something is done. Kairos is the time suitable for the action. So chronos can be kairos, but kairos is not chronos. Kairos is the appropriateness of what is finished occurring within chronos. That's on page 222 if you happen to have a copy of that book. It's a great book to have in your arsenal. The English word time in Romans 8:18 is from kairos, not chronos, the specific term referring to, according to Strong's, the set and proper time. That is, the time that was proper for the fulfillment of prophecy as set by the great architect himself. So interestingly, the Kingdom Interlinear translation of the Greek reads, the now appointed time in Romans 8:18. And the phrase, the now, quote unquote, emphasizes or modifies the appointed time, as if to say in translation, the appointed time which is now, thus referring only to the sufferings of a specific era, not to the sufferings of all saints since the time of Adam or even up to us today. In other words, Paul wasn't speaking about our suffering, even though we find people constantly going to Romans 8 to apply it to our suffering today. Our suffering today is nothing like what they went through then, and Paul is speaking about what they were going through in reference to what was being fulfilled in their time. Notice just how detailed Paul was in this one verse. Number one, he wrote of the appointed time for the fulfillment of God's prophecies concerning the revelation of his glory or kingdom. Number two, he emphasized that appointed time by his choice of the Greek word for now, that is, in the mid-8050s. And number three, he wrote of it as to be revealed in them, that is, in their generation. So according to Paul here, when was the appointed time for the fulfillment of prophecy? That's right, nearly 2,000 years ago. In them, in that generation, way back then, on the other side of the planet. In fact, Paul shows the same phrase two other times. Firstly, in Romans chapter 3, 25 and 26. God set forth his Son to be an atonement by his blood through faith to demonstrate his righteousness, because in his forbearance God had passed over the sins that were previously committed in order to demonstrate his righteousness in the now appointed time, that is, in that or their generation of time, that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. And secondly, in Romans 11 verse 5, it says, in the now appointed time, there is a remnant. And we'll need to come back to this verse later. Another thing of interest concerning the phrase, the present time, in Romans 8:18, is the initial portion of that verse that is contrast to the last portion of the verse. That is, the time when God's glory would be revealed in them. Firstly, what was meant by, quote unquote, the glory to be revealed in them? Well, Paul went on in verse 21 to write of the glorious liberty of the children of God, into which they would be delivered, quote unquote. A punctiliar action in their future. Punctiliar means a one-time action, like a period, instead of like a dash. A one-time action, an aorist tense type action in their future. That is, they were already God's children in one sense, according to verse 16, but the completion of his work related to the process of their becoming his legally forever established, thus glorified children was yet to be accomplished. See, that hadn't happened yet. It's like there was a period of adoption, of awaiting until the child actually becomes yours when you're in the process of adopting. There's a transition. In verse 23, Paul referred to this glorification as the adoption, the redemption of their body. I said there, it says our, but he's talking about our as in those people he's talking to them, to those who lived during that time. It was the adoption of their body, that is, their body as a whole. We'll get to that in a little bit in verse 23. Secondly, how far into the future of those folks would that glorification transpire? Well, by the language Paul employed here, it was obviously expected by him to occur within his or their lifetime. What language? Specifically the Greek term melo that he chose in verse 18. Listen to this. It reads like this in the original. The glory which is about to be revealed in us. See, it doesn't say that in the New King James Version. It simply says, the glory which shall be revealed in us. The Greek word melo means about to be revealed in us. We don't have time to go into an in-depth study of this term. That would take an entire lesson all in itself. So just allow me to say here that in 8 lexicons I consulted, every lexicographer used the phrase about to either as their definition or within their definition. In the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, it says that melo refers to what is about to be, that is, on the point of occurring or immediately impending. And in 7 different interlinears, it's translated as about to 81% of the time, and one respected interlinear even translates it as about to in every single New Testament case. That's 111 of them. If you'd like to know more about melo, just email me at tedenton64@hotmail.com and I'll send you some more on that. Anyway, verse 18 paraphrased then would say something like this. I consider that the sufferings of the appointed time now aren't worthy to be compared with the glory which is about to be revealed in us. So do you catch the encouragement there? The encouragement that is being given to these people who are within this dust bowl, so to speak, of persecution, and even some Christians during that generation being martyred. Again, it's Paul giving encouragement. Now we're having these sufferings, and these sufferings were at an appointed time. These things were going to happen, but we're about to be glorified in the Lord. Okay, let's focus attention on verse 19 now, most specifically on the term creature or creation, depending on which version you're reading. We don't have time to consider the numerous interpretations of this word. I'll leave it up to you to dig up all the bizarre explanations which have been conjured up in order to support misguided presuppositions, such as what I firmly believe and taught myself, namely that it has reference to the entirety of our existence here, including plants, animals, humans, and even the very planet itself with the ground and waters, But you can check in all that if you want. I don't have time to share with you what I now believe is definitely what Paul meant to get across to these people when he used this language. It amazes me how some of the same folks who preach against taking a passage figuratively when it can be understood literally will force this passage to be figurative. How can it be interpreted literally, you ask? Well, let's just get a big picture of the general context, then hone in on our text. Throughout Romans, Paul dealt with the theme of New Covenant grace versus Old Covenant law. Like bookends, he emphasized salvation by grace as opposed to the law, chapter 1, 16 to 17, and chapter 16, 25 to 26. Now, after his thesis statement in chapter 1, we find him in chapter 2 jumping right into talking mainly negatively about law. The law being the epitome of law in general. According to the concordance, Paul used the word law without the definite article the 9 times, and with the definite article 61 times, coming to a total of 70 times in 7.5 chapters. That is, from the beginning of Romans up to our text. And he wrote the positive things only grace and contradistinction to law could provide, that is, salvation, justification, righteousness, etc., around the same number of times, around 70. So in Romans, at least up to chapter 8, we see not only difference between what the covenants offered them, but also their transitional struggle of leaving behind an old mode of life for a new mode of life. And this was spoken of as living according to or by the flesh, that is, with a carnal way of thinking spoken of 20 times in the first 7.5 chapters, versus living by or according to the Spirit, that is, with a godly way of thinking, which is emphasized 30 times in the first 7.5 chapters. So by the time Paul gets to chapter 8, which by the way concludes the first major section of Romans, he had the minds of his readers really hungering for his solution to his rhetorical question in chapter 7, verse 24. O wretched man that I am, who or what would deliver me from this body of death? So, as we'll continue to consider, in chapter 8, verses 18 through 23, he answered the problem of their groanings for them. So you ask, what's the creation then of Romans 8, 19 through 22? Well, it's God's own creation of his old covenant law system with its people, Israel. Okay, say it one more time. The creation of Romans 8, 19 through 22 is God's old covenant law system with its people, Israel. They and their law was his creation. However, in this text, I'm convinced Paul had special reference to the faithful to him of Israel. That is, his continuous remnant from one generation to the next, finally ending with the one in which Paul himself lived, Romans 11, verse 5. This means that he was primarily focused on the sufferings of God's true people from beginning to end, from Adam and Abel to Peter and Paul, as it were, from the first Adam to the last Adam, who is about to come for them, according to Romans 5, verse 14. So, again, to make this real clear, I believe now, according to the context, that the creation is referring specifically to the faithful of Israel, the faithful of God, ever since the beginning of God's redemptive plan with the first Adam, through the last Adam, who was Jesus. Referring to them. And you'll see a little bit more why I say that as we go along here. For passages that speak about national Israel as being the people God created, that is, set aside for himself, just check out Isaiah 43, verses 1 and 7, and Psalm 100, verse 3, as well as numerous others I'm sure we could find throughout Hebrew Scriptures. Just verses later in Psalms, namely Psalm 102, verse 18, David prophesied of God's new people who were yet to be created. So there was the old covenant created people of God, creation of God, and according to David in Psalm 102, there'd be another people of God that he would create, a new creation. That would be us. New covenant creation versus old covenant creation. Old covenant people versus new covenant people. Then later we find the Greek scriptures speaking of those who accepted God's Son as Messiah as being his created, that is, chosen or set aside people in Ephesians 2 verses 10 and 15 and Ephesians 4:24. Following that, we find in Hebrews 9:11 that it says that Christ came as high priest of the good things about to come. There's that word mellow again. With the greater and more perfect tabernacle not made with hands, that is, not of this creation. Now, what creation in Hebrews 9:11 would he have been speaking about? Well, the context is actually pretty clear here. This creation, Hebrews 9:11, the creation of all things related to national Israel and her old tabernacle or temple service of the context of the chapter. Nothing in that chapter would lead one to think of the literal planet Earth with plants and animals and all that kind of stuff being involved when it talks about the creation. It's the creation of Old Covenant people, their law, their temple, their sacrifices, their priesthood, and all of that. In fact, consider Hebrews 9 relative to Romans 8 for a moment. This is pretty cool. Think about this now. Just as Hebrews 9 tells us about how that present time, still standing creation, that is, the temple with its zealots, verses 8 and 9 of Hebrews 9, was facing its doom in the about to arrive perfect tabernacle at the time of Reformation, verses 10 and 11, so Romans 8 tells us about how that present time, verse 18, groaning, 22 and 23, and eagerly expectant creation, verses 19 and 23, was facing its about to arrive, verse 18, redemption, verse 23. Wow. I mean, it's like you can take Romans 8 and lay it over the top of Hebrews 9, or Hebrews 9 laid over the top of Hebrews 8. I believe, incidentally, that Paul wrote Hebrews. Paul wrote Romans. He's saying the same thing in both passages in different words. There are just too many parallels between Romans 8 and Hebrews 9 to deny this position, at least in my estimation. Now, let's focus momentarily on the revealing of the children of God in Romans 8:19. A little bit ago, when talking about the revelation of glory, which was about to take place in that first generation of God's new covenant people, I said that Paul explained what he meant by that when he went on to write in verse 21 about the glorious liberty of children of God and the adoption and redemption of their plural body, singular. Now here at the end of verse 19, we also see another parallel phrase for all of this, namely the revealing of the children of God. What did it mean to reveal his children? Well, as mentioned in the outset, this passage clearly indicates that all of this was a transitional phase of God's plan between leaving his old creation, the old heavens and earth, the old covenant people and law and all that, and moving into the new creation, the new heavens and earth, with its new people under grace, the spiritual temple, spiritual kingdom, etc. Another way to say this is that he was abandoning in his wake the old covenant body of his people, which had fulfilled its purpose, and was moving into the brand new covenant body of his people. So it's no wonder that there was the great strife between these two groups, as they were, in essence, at the time of Paul, vying for the Father's love. With God leaving the old covenant people behind and accepting his new covenant people, there was going to be strife. Transitions are difficult no matter how they're found or where in our lives they're found. Transitions are very difficult. This was a transition among a people. The remnant was being chosen to start a new covenant people, and the old covenant people didn't like that, but they didn't want to accept Jesus as Messiah either. Anyway, as Revelation indicates, though old Israel, which seemed to be winning out since they were far greater in number, God himself was about to clearly demonstrate which group, national Israel or Christians, were his chosen people. Daniel 7:22 prophesied about this very event, saying that in this event, judgment would be made in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time would be for the saints to possess the kingdom. When? When the Ancient of Days, Jesus Christ, came, or in this case, returned. In the coming of Christ, during the events surrounding AD 70, all Israel knew and bowed the knee in defeat with the realization that this sect of Christians were indeed the or God's chosen ones. So, verse 19 then makes a little more sense. The earnest expectation, that is, of the old covenant creation are the ones who were eagerly waiting for the sons of God to be revealed, matching Daniel 7 and which was fulfilled in AD 70, when God clearly made a distinction between who he was choosing as his new covenant people and who he was rejecting. So look at verses 20 through 21 now, where it says, "For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope, because the creation itself will also be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God." With the position that the creation in this context refers primarily to the faithful remnant of each successive generation of God's old covenant people, especially of that last generation there during Paul's time, it isn't difficult to see how being subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of God who subjected them in hope makes perfect sense. In other words, for God to work out his plan for man's redemption as he did since the time of Adam, he had to break some eggs, so to speak. His beloved remnant had to endure living under the law of sin and death, as well as often suffering persecution, captivities, and everything else, even to the point of death. Thus the groanings, verses 22, 23, and 26, all a part of there being details in the Lord's big picture. So you had God's people. God always had a remnant. Most of the time, most all of Israel mistreated God. They acted like they hated God. But there was always a remnant. The ones who were left alone, the ones who maybe didn't have to endure the captivity or whatever, all through the Old Covenant from the time of Adam on down. But, of course, when we talk of Israel, we mainly think of Moses on down, which we can do that too. That's fine here. It's just, you got to keep that in mind here, that the creation are those of God's remnant who always trusted in him with every successive generation, and God loved them and helped to keep them going so that the Messiah could come through their lineage. And that remnant, the last remnant of the last generation, would become the Messiah's bride. So the bondage of corruption in verse 21 refers to the decomposing of the Old Covenant body of death that Paul brought up in chapter 7, verse 24, when he asked, "Who shall deliver me from this body of death?" This body that is dying, taking, of course, its members right along with it. Chapter 8, verse 11. See, it's talking about the corporate body of Israel. Paul was, as part of the remnant, he was part of Israel. Israel was dying. She was the seed of 1 Corinthians 15, at least part of it. The seed being her and the old covenant creation, the old heavens and earth, the law, and all of that. Paul was part of that. He was part of the transition coming out of that. And it was hurtful, it was very difficult. Who will deliver me, and what shall deliver me from this body of death? And that body was corporate. It included many, many members. Now, if one didn't want to be in that mortal, which simply means dying, body of Moses, when it actually died, he or she had to die to it. Romans 7, verse 4. Thereby coming to life in the body of Christ. So they had a choice during this transition period between the time Jesus died and resurrected until he returned in AD 70. They had a choice during that last generation of transitional time to either remain with the dying body or be delivered from it and placed into the coming to life body. That which was coming out of the dying body. It's like you had a woman who was giving birth and dying in that birth. She was dying but giving life to a new life, the new covenant. So people had a choice. Are you going to be part of the woman who's dying? Or are you going to be part of the new Jerusalem, the new body that she was producing and would have life eternal? Let's briefly consider verse 22. We know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs together till now. Notice here that Paul chose to employ the word together, implying that more than a single entity was groaning, thus supporting even more the idea of the creation being comprised of the various remnants down through Old Covenant history. Just check out Revelation 6, 9 through 11. So Paul spoke of God's faithful remnant as a whole here, having had to experience the labor pangs of the process and fulfillment of God's redemptive plan. And very fittingly, of course, since we've discussed how this rough transitional period would come to its end around the events of AD 70, we shouldn't consider it strange that Jesus, in his Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 about the fall of Jerusalem, spoke of the things leading up to it as the pangs of birth in verse 8 of Matthew 24. Also, in verse 22, Paul wrote of how all the sufferings of God's faithful through the ages lasted all the way up, quote, until now, unquote. That is, up until that generation, the generation about whom he went on to write in the last verse of our text, verse 23. So let's head toward the end of this study by considering verse 23. And not only they, but we also who have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves, grown within ourselves, eagerly waiting for the adoption and redemption of our body. Here Paul moved from speaking about the successive remnants of God's people in Israel's history to the members of the last of those remnants, the one of his generation, the last generation of God's temporary Old Covenant people as they were transitioning into his permanent New Covenant people. So what did Paul mean by first fruits of the Spirit? Well, firstly, we need to say a couple things about the word first fruits, or first fruit. Much like even today in our English language, whether we read fruit or fruits in the Bible, we simply cannot be dogmatic about whether or not the speaker or writer had single or multiple things in mind if he didn't specify. For two quick examples, in Matthew 3:8 and Luke 3:8, we have the same statement made by John the Baptist. Yet in the Greek, the term for fruit or fruits, depending on your version, is singular in Matthew while it's plural in Luke. Okay? And in Matthew 7:16 through 20, we have Jesus using the term fruit or fruits 7 times, switching between the singular Greek term and the plural Greek term. So it's just one of those language anomalies about which we must simply acknowledge exists and not create a theology out of it. Most of the time, by far, as here in verse 23, the writer had multiple things in mind, yet in a collective sense. To the Hebrews, the term first fruit or first fruits could refer either to that which was especially presented or dedicated to God, from whom all blessings flow, James 1:17-18, or as here in Romans 8:23, to the first taste of that which was about to come at harvest time. See, in James, the people themselves were the first fruits, while here the people possessed the first fruits in Romans 8. So, secondly, what did it mean for Paul to say that the Christians of his day possessed the first fruit of the Spirit? Well, the answer, I believe, is found in the promised or prophesied purpose of the Spirit. According to Ezekiel 37, the Spirit, as with any spirit, which, by the way, may be translated breath, was given for the purpose of providing life to the, might I say, spiritually dead, that is, to those truly desiring yet lacking the immortality of God. Paul wrote of this in Ephesians 1:13b through 14, telling them that the Holy Spirit of promise was the guarantee of their inheritance until the redemption of the purchased possession. And when was that work of redemptive life to be realized? Jesus in Luke 21:28 said it would be at the demise of all things related to national Israel. He told them, when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies and getting ready to be destroyed, look up because your redemption is near. Redemption occurred in its fullness around the time of Jerusalem's demise. See, these first generation Christians, the foundation upon whom we are built, with Jesus being a chief cornerstone, of course, were, as James said, the first fruits who were simultaneously in that time of transition tasting the life that was being breathed into the dead body under the law of sin and death. They were tasting the glory which was about to be revealed in the true children of God, verses 18 and 19, tasting the fulfillment of their hope, verses 20 and 24 and 25, tasting the glorious liberty that was on their horizon, verse 21, and tasting the redemption of that old body of death in which they resided, verse 23, and in chapter 7, verse 24. It's just this beautiful picture of transitioning and how the Spirit was there breathing life into that new body. Spirit, breath, breathing life into that body. And once that body became a mature body, then the Spirit's primary work was accomplished. And Jesus could then return to receive his purified, sanctified bride to himself and create a union to which you and I today are children. So in summary, as he spoke of in various other passages such as 2 Corinthians chapters 3 through 5, Paul is encouraging them in reference to their difficult time of transitioning from their old covenant mode of existence to their new covenant mode of existence. They, being a chosen generation to see the fulfillment of the prophecies concerning man's redemption, were themselves being transformed from one stage of glory, the Moses stage, into another stage of glory, the Christ stage. 2 Corinthians 3:18. So they should hang in there, for their transformation was about to culminate in its finished product at the time of the harvest, resurrecting that old dead body into the new living body. I'm Tony Denton, and this has been my speech on Romans 8, 18 through 23, which I put together in July of 2014.